We are honored to have the following veterans of the Battle of Midway here with us today. Captain John Crawford, United States Navy. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Miller, USN. Lieutenant J.G. Truxton Ford, USN. Chief Gunner's Mate Hank Kudzik, USN. Chief Yeoman Bill Norberg, USN. And Cook Third Class William Fentress, USN. In recognition of their service, Admiral John Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, has decreed this date, 5 June 2017, to be Battle of Midway Commemoration Day. The Battle of Midway Day Proclamation, 5 June 2017, a proclamation by the United States Navy's Chief of Naval Operations. Whereas the United States Navy recognizes the great significance of the Battle of Midway as one of the greatest victories in its history and in that of our great nation. Whereas the sailors of the United States Navy take great pride in their service to our country and now take time to acknowledge their forebears who set the standards of service and sacrifice that form the hallmarks of our rich naval heritage and history. Whereas we set forth resolutely to preserve and celebrate the legacy of the Battle of Midway's many heroes and their invaluable contributions to the Navy and our nation. Whereas we use the model of determination, zeal, and valor from our past to meet the challenges of the future. Now, therefore, I, John M. Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, by virtue of the authority vested in me, do hereby proclaim 5 June 2017 Battle of Midway Commemoration Day, and call upon all sailors to take part in the ceremony and remember those who have led the way through their bravery and who have sacrificed to make ours the world's greatest Navy. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand this 5th day of June 2017, the 241st year of independence of the United States of America. Signed, John M. Richardson, Admiral, United States Navy. Rear Admiral Rock will now present copies of the proclamation to each of our honored Midway veterans. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce one of our foremost naval historians, Mr. Robert J. Cressman. Mr. Cressman earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in history from the University of Maryland and has spent his entire career as a historian with the Department of the Navy. Now with the Emergent Response Section of the History and Archives Division of NHAC, he is currently the editor and principal contributor to the online dictionary of American naval fighting ships. His work, The Official Chronology of the U.S. Navy in World War II, received a John Lyman Book Award in 1999, while the Admiral Arthur W. Radford Award recognizes his body of work in the history of the U.S. naval aviation in 2008. He has authored 4 books, co-authored 6, has written more than 80 articles, and has appeared on the History and Discovery channels. Would you please join me in welcoming Mr. Cressman?
Thank you very much. put together a little slideshow here because there'll be a presentations after this that will cover the battle in more depth. Anything you have on Midway, you have to have Goonies. They're all over the place. And that's a pair of them in June of '41, before the war started. And that's Midway from the air in November. Eastern and Sand Islands, a reef encircling the islands. It's at one end of the Hawaiian chain. There were some other islands as well. We'll get to those in a second. Okay, next. This is the one of the main hangars at Midway. The Japanese bombarded Midway on the 7th of December, the first day of the war. It was 2 destroyers with 5-inch guns. And that hangar would later be destroyed on 4 June. So it got pretty badly shot up twice within 6-7 months. Next. On the 2nd of May, Admiral Nimitz flew out to Midway Island to get a look for himself at what the place looked like and to talk with the defenders on what lay ahead. The fellow that's getting an award there, that's a picture of him during flight training, about 1940. He was killed in action a month and 2 days later. And there's Admiral Nimitz with Colonel Ira Kimes, who headed the Marine Aircraft Group. The fellow in the tie is Captain Cyril Simard, who was in charge of the Naval Air Station at Midway. That's some of the aircraft that were used at Midway on board the Enterprise, 11 May 1942, when she was in the South Pacific with Hornet. The oiler Sabine is coming up in the background. The main types we see here is a Wildcat in the foreground, an F-4 fighter, and then the SBD-3 Dauntlesses in the background were the equipment for Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6. There's the Hornet coming back to Pearl Harbor from the cruise in the South Pacific. In the foreground, you see a couple of tractors that they used for bringing seaplanes ashore. This is taken from the seaplane base at one end of Ford Island, which was actually the first place hit in the Japanese attack on the 7th of December. There's Yorktown coming to Pearl Harbor on May 27th, coming back after the Battle of Coral Sea. You notice in the photograph of Hornet coming in, her crew was in dungarees, in blues. These fellows are in whites. Yorktown was a very classy ship. I have a very special part of my heart for her because I wrote a book on her called That Gallant Ship. And one of the tugs that's right there in the foreground was present during the Japanese attack on 7 December and performed very heroically, and in fact is still around. That's the Hoga. And there's Yorktown in dry dock, having some hull work done. You can see the extent of the fouling on the hull, which means she's been at sea a long time. And this, a Marine called a strange and wonderful ship. It's the Kitty Hawk, which you'll see is not a Greyhound of the sea. She was originally a train ferry. And indicative of the many types of ships that the Navy acquired, the saying being that when you need ships, it's too late to build them. The Kitty Hawk and her sister ship, Hammondsport, were very vital for carrying cargoes of aircraft to like the South Pacific. And in fact, this was the ship that took reinforcements to Midway. Well, the aircraft were new to the Marines. They were former Army or former Navy aircraft. And so this ship arrived on the 26th of May with Marine aircraft reinforcements. There's a couple of Vindicators taking off. Vought SB-2U3s. They were front line about 1938, 39, but by 1941 and 42, they were being outclassed. You see this picture often in books saying these are the guys taking off at the Battle of Midway. Well, they took off very early in the morning, so the shadow would not be right underneath. So this is actually taken during the period when the Marines were feverishly working up, because a lot of these pilots had fairly recently gotten their wings. They had to go up against the Japanese Navy. Okay, next. In fact, that aircraft was lost on 4th of June, and the pilot and radioman killed. 27th of May, there was a decoration ceremony on the Enterprise. And here Admiral Nimitz is decorating Captain Murray, who was one of the early naval aviators. And after the battle, he wrote to his wife, and he talked about the battle that had just taken place. And he said that he described war as a grim and terrible business, because Enterprise, there were a lot of empty tables, empty chairs in the wardroom and in the enlisted men's mess. Now, what's interesting is in the background, all the way over on the right, is C. Wade McCluskey, who commanded the Enterprise Air Group, who made a key decision during the battle to follow a Japanese destroyer that was going full tilt to rejoin the task force after trying to sink the Nautilus. And his hunch was correct, that she was going toward the Japanese carrier force. And it was like they just followed that, and the Enterprise Air Group arrived, the Yorktown Air Group arrived, and the rest, as they say, is history. Next. And there's Yorktown on the way to the Battle of Midway, as seen from the Portland. And she's got a deck load of aircraft. And we suspect that that was taken probably around the 31st of May. Next. Now this is Kure Island, one of the islands in the Hawaiian chain. We'll just run through these real briefly. Necker, see there's not much there. Pearl and Hermes Reef was actually a place where the Japanese had refueled seaplanes, and one of them bombed Pearl Harbor in March. And one of the intelligence officers, Alec Hudson, had written fiction about a submarine-based seaplane bombing Hawaii. So Hudson thought, well, you know, if that worked in fiction, it could work in real life. And they checked up, and it turns out that that's what the Japanese were going to do before Midway. But because we'd figured that out, we had ships there. The Pruce Pinnacle is another very small spot in a very large ocean. Sea Gardner Pinnacles, same thing. Laysan Island, same thing. But as part of the fleet plan for this battle, ships like this, you say, well, it looks like a tuna boat. Well, that's what it was. And they were equipped to carry fuel and supplies to replenish the Catalina flying boats and also pick up people if they happened to crash nearby. So they were very important in the battle. This kind of gives you an idea of some of the close-in weaponry on the Yorktown. This is one of the 20-millimeter galleries manned by Marines. And this is a 5-inch 25 anti-aircraft gun on board the Astoria, which was one of the cruisers that took part in the battle. This was a diorama that was done after the war. And this depicts the torpedoing of the Kibano Maru, which was a tanker as part of this, one of the Japanese forces. And here are the 4 plane commanders that took part in the strike. Second from right is Lieutenant Commander Richards. He was in command. And this is another diorama depicting VMF 221, excuse me, attacking the incoming Japanese force. Incredibly heroic action by these Marine pilots, some of whom, as I said, had just recently attained their wings. And this is Major Floyd Parks, commanding officer of VMF 221. He was killed in action on the 4th of June. This is a high-altitude photograph taken from an Air Force B-17 attempting to bomb the Hiryu. But as you can see, they didn't come close. But these attacks from Midway forced the Japanese to scatter their force, their carriers and destroyers, and messed up their timing for a lot of their operations. So while it was relatively unsuccessful attacks, they did succeed in a major scattering of the Japanese force, and they forced them to regroup. And in fact, it so messed up the carrier formation that the Hiryu actually ended up far enough away from the other three carriers that she was not hit in the strike that hit from the Enterprise and the Yorktown. This is the only surviving Grumman TBF-1 Avenger. And if you read somewhere that says the Avenger was named to avenge these guys' loss at Midway, the aircraft type received its nickname in October of 1941, before there was any Battle of Midway. But this was the only plane to get back out of the 6 that were launched. And the reason why they only had 6 at Midway was they couldn't take any more aircraft at Midway, because they had B-17s, they had PBYs, they had B-26s. But there were 6 of these that took off. The pilot, Bert Ernest, received 2 Navy Crosses after this mission. He received one for making the attack and one for bringing the plane back to be evaluated and looked at. I forget the number of holes in it, but it was an incredible number. The gunner had been killed in the turret, and the radioman had been hit by a shell fragment and knocked unconscious. So essentially the pilot was the only guy conscious flying the plane back, and he thought he was going to have to ditch, but he got last-minute control, kept it aloft, and got back to Midway, safe and sound. And that is one of the surviving SBDs that the Marines flew. That also had a very large number of holes in it. The pilot and radioman both survived. And I've actually sat in both cockpits, because that's down at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. Incredible airplane.
Yes, sir.
Next. Oh, I guess we're up live feed. We're live.
Back to Midway Island. And of the 4 Air Force B-26s, 1 was shot down, 2 dropped torpedoes against the flagship of the Japanese force, the Akagi, which missed, but one of the planes strafed the Akagi's flight deck, and the 3rd plane, whether it was uncontrollable or whether the pilot deliberately tried to crash his crippled aircraft into the Akagi, missed the bridge of that ship by a matter of feet, sparing the lives of Admiral Nagumo, who was the commander of the Japanese task force. But the result of that strike and the losses incurred at Midway Island caused Admiral Nagumo